Good morning, students. I myself, Dr. Sree Kumar, Assistant Professor working in Department of Physiology, Sree Balaji Medical College. Today's topic is on homeostasis. So, in physiology, the word homeostasis is a major thing to understand for each and every concepts. So, let us see in detail about homeostasis. So if you take a word homeostasis and if you split into homeo and stasis. So homeo means sameness and stasis means standing still. So by definition, homeostasis, the body's ability to maintain a relatively constant internal environment despite changes in external environment. So this internal as well as the external environment is maintaining constantly, right? So the term homeostasis is first termed by the person Walter B. Cannon, and the other person who is called Claude Bernal. He is a French physiologist who terms the word internal milieu. So these two persons who got a major contribution for the homeostasis mechanisms to get understand. So as I said, the internal environment as well as the external environment. Let us see about what is internal environment. So the internal environment, so you know our bodies is made up of cells. So all the cells in our body is surrounded by fluids. So that fluid is called extracellular fluid. So you know the number of cells in our body is almost 100 trillion cells, whereas the red cells in our body is almost 25 trillion and other cells which contributes about 75 trillion. So the human body is as well made up of fluids. So fluids. So these are the fluids which is main contribution for the internal environment. So almost 56% of a body is made up of fluid and 44% is made up of other solid substances. So the total body fluids, that is intracellular fluid as well as the extracellular fluid. So the intracellular fluid which contributes almost 2/3 of the body, which is mainly contributes of potassium, phosphate and proteins, and extracellular fluid which is almost 1/3, which contains more of sodium, chloride, oxygen, fatty acids and glucose. So these fluids, how it's get maintained? Through a specialized system called as circulatory system. So not only the circulatory system, as well as we also need nutrition, to maintain, and the origin of nutrition. So there are almost 10 systems in our body which maintains these homeostatic mechanisms, such as nervous system, hormonal system, reproductive system, urinary system, and the many other systems. So how the homeostasis is going to get maintained? Through some specialized mechanisms called as feedback mechanisms. So the feedback mechanisms, there are two types of feedback mechanisms. One is positive feedback mechanism, the other is negative feedback mechanisms. So the negative feedback mechanism, what is it? It opposes a response to stimulus, and the positive feedback mechanism which enhances response to stimulus. So let us see in detail about these feedback mechanisms to understand about the homeostatic process. This picture, which elaborately explains the internal environment and the external environment that is maintained through homeostatic mechanisms. So as we know, there are many systems which is responsible for the homeostatic mechanism processes, such as respiratory system, whereby it contributes by the exchange of gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, in circulatory system, which contributes through the system by the blood circulation, the digestive system, which helps by ingestion of food, salts and water that will get digested, and unabsorbed matter which gets eliminated, in urinary system, which contributes by organic waste products, salts and water by eliminating. And apart from other systems like nervous system, hormonal system, reproductive system, etc. So as already discussed about the negative feedback systems, let us see in detail about the negative feedback mechanisms. So it is a predominant mechanism for homeostasis control, almost 99%, which contributes for the homeostatic mechanism. So it maintains physiological functions within the narrow limit, and even it controls which requires continuous time to time adjustment for the maintaining of homeostasis. Some examples of negative feedback mechanisms, such as maintaining the thyroxine level. Second example is oxygen buffering function of hemoglobin. The third is carbon dioxide through respiratory center, and the last atrial blood pressure through baroreceptors. And these negative feedback mechanisms, how it get function, that is like gain equal to correction slash error. And other feedback mechanism is positive feedback systems. This positive feedback mechanism usually controls infrequent events that are self perpetuating and explosive, and they do not control events which require continuous adjustments to promote moment to moment well-being. So it is not equally to your. So like negative feedback mechanisms, positive feedback mechanisms have very least, and there are many useful effects which also seen in this positive feedback mechanisms. So let us see about the useful effects. The first effect is the blood clotting mechanism. Next, uterine contraction during childbirth, sodium entry into the nerve cell causing action potential. And some harmful effects is also seen in this positive feedback mechanisms, like loss of blood, that is more than 2 liters, that if there is a more increase in loss, leading to decreased venous return and leads to decreased cardiac output, thereby inducing the low blood pressure. So if the low blood pressure is maintained, there is a decreased coronary blood flow, leading to decreased contractility of the heart, so leading to the death following the reduced blood flow to the vital organs. So by the positive feedback mechanisms, if there is an extreme dysfunction, leads to death, and moderate dysfunction of positive feedback mechanism leads to sickness. The homeostatic control mechanisms have 3 independent components. So what are these independent components? The one is receptor, the second is control center, and the third is effector. So what the receptor will do? So it acts as a sensor that responds to stimuli, and this control center, it determines set point, analyzes the input and determines the appropriate responses. And the last is the effector, which provides mean for the control center responses. So if there is an imbalance in the internal environment, that is a homeostatic mechanisms, if there is an imbalance, these three components such as receptor, control center and effector will act and to become the imbalance to the variable, or it becomes the normal homeostatic mechanisms. So if there is a stimulus from the imbalance homeostatic changes, this signals to the receptor, that is on sensor. So this input signals that information sent along with the afferent pathway to the control center. From the control center, it gives signals to the output center, that is your effector organ. So this information sent along with the efferent pathway, and this effector will show the response of effector feedback to influence the magnitude as well as the stimulus, and returns variable to the homeostatic mechanisms, and thereby maintaining the normal homeostatic process or balance. This picture which clearly explains the blood pressure control. So if there is a change in blood pressure, so this blood pressure changes is being sensed or being captured by the receptors like baroreceptor centers in blood vessels. So from the receptors, it gives signals through the nerve impulses to the control center, to the brain. Okay, so once the brain, it gets senses, and this from the brain, it gives output signals through the same nerve impulses to the effector organ, that is nothing but your heart. So once the heart is get sensed, so there is a decrease in heart rate, thereby reducing the blood pressure. So thus the homeostatic mechanism of the blood pressure is being monitored by the input signals and through the effector organ, and thus by blood pressure is maintained. Another interesting example for negative feedback mechanism is our blood glucose regulation. So when you eat, you will be there is an increase in blood glucose level, and once the blood glucose level is been increased, there is a send signals to the islets of Langerhans in pancreas, thereby producing the hormone insulin. So once the insulin is produced, there is an increased cellular uptake of glucose, thereby reducing the blood glucose level. So once this blood glucose level is controlled, what happens? The signals from the cell, it gives a negative feedback loop to stop producing the insulin level at the islets of Langerhans level. Okay, once the insulin level is stopped, again the stoppage of insulin takes place, thereby maintaining the blood glucose level, right? And another interesting example for negative feedback mechanism is blood volume regulation by antidiuretic hormone. So if there is a blood volume is reduced due to dehydration, there sends a signal to the increased osmolarity of plasma. So once the dehydration is happened, so there will be an increased osmolality in the plasma level. So this osmolality changes which sends signals to the osmoreceptors in hypothalamus. This hypothalamus sends signals to the thirst center, thereby inducing water. The persons will take intake of water, thereby maintaining the dehydration. So the dehydration is lost. So not only this osmoreceptors in hypothalamus send signals to the thirst center, as well as it will send signal to the posterior pituitary gland, thereby increasing the antidiuretic hormone. And this antidiuretic hormone will act on the renal level, thereby increasing the reabsorption of water. So thereby preventing increased amount of excretion of urine, thereby maintaining the blood volume regulation. So another important example for negative feedback mechanism is thyroid hormone regulation. So if there is an increase or decreased thyroid hormone level, that is T3 and T4, if this sends signals to the hypothalamus, so if there is an increase or decrease, anyway it is going to get sensed by the hypothalamus, thereby producing the thyroid releasing hormone. If there is a decrease in T3 and T4, leading to stimulating the anterior pituitary gland by producing the hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone. So this thyroid stimulating hormone in turns enters into the blood circulation, stimulating the thyroid gland by, and if there is an increased in T3 and T4, it will decrease T3 T4. If there is a decrease in T3 T4, it will stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more number of T3 and T4 cells, making the normal level of thyroid hormones. So it is like a loop mechanisms. Okay, so once the T3 and T4 is maintained in the blood circulation, and this T3 and T4 will act as a negative loop mechanism to inhibit the both glands, that is anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. So some lower vertebrates and lower animals, which they regulate the body temperature with the help of water. You can see in this picture this big mammoth elephant during the summer season, it maintains its body temperature by pouring the water on its own body. Okay, so likewise our humans, we need to maintain the regulation of temperature internally as well as the external, okay, based on the external body temperature. So how this regulation of temperature is maintained in our body? Through regulation of heat loss through the blood capillaries. Okay, so through vasoconstriction as well as the vasodilation. If there is a more vasodilation, so there will be more blood circulation, leading to more loss of heat, okay, across the epidermis, thereby maintaining the body temperature. So now let us see about the example for positive feedback mechanisms. So one such positive feedback mechanism is parturition. So what is parturition? It is nothing but the expulsion of fetus from the womb during the labor, right? So there are different stages, that is stage 1, stage 2 and stage 3. So from the stage 1, that is initial or the latent phase, from the latent phase it enters into the active phase. Okay, so from this latent to the active phase, thereby producing the positive feedback mechanism that makes the fetus to get expelled. So let us see how the fetus is get expelled from the womb or from the uterine wall. So during the process of parturition, the head of the fetus will come and contact with the cervix. So once the contact it's get on the cervix, there is a stimulation. So there is a signals is sent through positive feedback mechanisms, where how through it sends signals to the posterior pituitary, thereby producing oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. This oxytocin thereby inducing the uterine contraction. So the more and more the head of the body, head of the fetus, which comes in contact with the uterus, thereby producing more oxytocin by the stretch reflex, which happens at the cervix. As a gist, we have seen that by definition, the homeostasis, the different mechanisms of homeostasis, and how the homeostatic mechanism is been functioning based on different control mechanisms, and what are the examples of positive feedback mechanisms and negative feedback mechanisms, and the difference between the positive and negative feedback mechanisms and the examples. Hope everyone been understand this concept homeostasis and just implement in different subjects based on the homeostatic mechanism lecture. For understanding more medical concepts, please do watch and subscribe the YouTube channel Sree Balaji Medical Lecturers. Thank you.